When do you eat expensive food just for the status? I don't like ketchup on my steak. I never have. I never will. However, I grew up working my family restaurants, and every now and then, we'd get a customer who put ketchup on their steaks. Inevitably, other customers would make fun of them, mock them, call them uncultured, etc. The thing to understand is, we ran a basic greasy spoon restaurant, burgers and fries. My grandma was a fantastic cook and also made delicious homemade pies, cooked many meals from scratch, made her own gravy, etc. While most of the stuff on our menus were delicious, the steaks were not. The steaks sucked. We didn't even want to sell steaks. We didn't have the space to store fresh steak meat, so we had to keep them frozen. So why did we sell steaks? Because some people insisted on having steak. Almost all of them did so purely for the flex and to let everyone else know how rich they were. So to stop them complaining about us not having steak, we had steak. Basic, cheap-ass blade steaks. Frozen. Cooked on a restaurant grill. We put no extra effort into making the steaks because we knew they sucked. We even tried to discourage selling steaks by making the prices exorbitantly high. For example, we charged 3 times more for steak and eggs than we did for pea meal. But the braggarts and egomaniacs would still order the crappy steaks just so they could rub their wealth in other people's noses. In retrospect, I think jacking up the prices just made the braggarts even happier. There's a certain hum to a diner when the breakfast rush hits, cutlery tapping, the grill's steady sizzle, sugar packets ripping like tiny paper fireworks. I grew up inside that soundtrack. I could flip a smash burger and answer the phone with my elbow, refill 4 coffees in one pass, and tell when the oil needed changing by smell alone. Grandma ran the back like a ship's galley, never missing a beat. Biscuit dough turned under her palms, cinnamon and butter blooming in the oven, gravy thickening in a battered pot that had outlived 2 managers and 1 marriage. People came for all that. Nobody came for steak. Still, the show-offs ordered it. They leaned back on the stools like petty oil barons, announce it just loud enough for neighboring tables to hear, steak and eggs, medium rare, then glance around to make sure the sentence landed. There was always one of them. In our place, his name was Carl. Carl was the kind of regular who thinks regular means deputy owner. He'd roll in with a watch big enough to count moon phases and take the end stool like it was a throne. Always steak and eggs, always a side of smug. He didn't just eat it, he made a point of narrating the experience. If someone near him ordered oatmeal, he'd smirk. Fueling up the tractor? If a college kid got pancakes, the menu's training wheels. He lived to draw a class line with a knife and a fork. Grandma tolerated him the way an oak tolerates a woodpecker, annoyed but unbothered. She measured people by how they treated the server with the sore wrist, the dishwasher with the shy smile, the kid training on his first terrified Saturday. By that metric, Carl never made varsity. Then there were the newcomers, the ones who didn't know our steak was a frozen pity purchase designed to keep peace with people like Carl. I had a script for them. When someone asked for steak, I'd lean in and speak low, confessional, the way you warn a friend about the bad movie you already paid for. Everything on the menu? Solid. The steak? Not our strong suit. Frozen blade does what it does. If you want meat, pea meal's the move. 9 times out of 10, they'd pivot. Eggs and pea meal. Or the skillet with the crispy hash browns that made grown men tear up. 1 out of 10 would shrug and take the gamble. That morning, the one that lives in my head rent-free, was a 1 out of 10 morning. He came in midweek, a guy with road dust on his jacket and the soft, relieved look of someone who's finally found coffee. Sat at the front counter near the sugar caddies, nodded hello to the old-timers playing crib in the corner, and ordered steak and eggs like he was asking for tap water. I gave him the warning. He laughed, said he'd risk it. "Call me Dave," he added like we'd met before. I dropped the chit on the wheel, called it back to Grandma, got the look, got the sigh, got the frozen steak thumped onto the grill with the weary resignation of a priest lighting incense at a funeral. We both knew how this ended. A lot of sawing, a lot of napkins, and a promise from Dave to order literally anything else next time. It came up looking like every steak we ever served. Brown where it should have been char, gray where it should have been blush, a stubborn ribbon of fat along the edge like a white flag that refused to wave. I plated it with eggs that were perfect and hash browns crisp to cathedral glass, because dignity is in the details, even when the headliner bombs. Dave cut in, chewed, made a face, and laughed. "You weren't kidding," he said, good-natured. "This steak sucks." Then he reached for the ketchup. 10 feet down the counter, Carl's radar beeped. He'd finished his own plate, had made a big show of it, naturally, and was nursing coffee like it was a brandy. He saw the red bottle tilt over Dave's steak, and his eyebrows climbed his forehead like stage curtains. He didn't address Dave. He addressed the air around him, loud enough to carry. "Some people," he announced to no one, and everyone, "have no taste." Ruining perfectly good meat with ketchup, Dave ignored it. He dabbed a red island on the plate, dragged a bite through it, and lived his life. Carl tried again, 1 notch louder. It's a shame, really. Folks don't know quality when it's right in front of them. I wiped the counter in front of Carl, slow and deliberate, the way you pet a dog you're about to put a cone on. "Carl," I said, "people can put whatever they want on their food. They're the ones eating it." He smiled without moving his mouth. "Some people just don't have any taste." I could have let it go. God knows I had before. You can't argue someone out of a personality trait, but I had spent my whole childhood listening to Grandma tell the truth softly enough that people could survive hearing it. I looked at Dave, who was trying not to be a problem. I looked at the grill where a pie was coming out that would make a man propose. I looked at Carl, who'd never once asked anyone in an apron how their day was, and I let the truth out. "I don't know, Carl," I said. "I can't blame him. I wouldn't eat the steak here either. We serve the cheapest cuts we can get. They're frozen half to death before they hit the grill. The meat's tough, and it tastes like regret. The only reason we carry it at all is for insecure people who need to overspend on cheap meat so they've got something to brag about." The counter went quiet in the way a room goes quiet when the preacher swears. One of the crib guys let out a laugh that turned into a cough. The cook bell dinged like a punchline. Carl's face did a 4-color weather map, pink to red to purple to bone. He opened his mouth, then closed it like he'd remembered he was in public. His little court of stool mates began the slow, delicious collapse into helpless children. chuckles. Dave raised his coffee cup at me in a tiny toast, then at Carl as if to say, no hard feelings, just better seasoning. He took another bite, ketchup and all, and grinned like a man who had successfully lowered the stakes of his morning. Carl shut up. He didn't leave. Men like Carl never leave when they've been read. They stay and adjust the story in their head until it flatters them again. He stirred his coffee for a full minute, discovered it did not become soup, and eventually asked for the check. When he signed it, his hand shook just enough for me to notice and not enough for him to admit. The diner's hum resumed. The pie cooled on its rack. Grandma slid me a look through the pass, half warning, half proud, and then went back to her gravy. Dave finished the plate, left a tip you could feel through the apron, and promised next time he'd try the pea meal. I told him there was a slice of butterscotch pie with his name on it if he did. He walked out smiling, like a man who didn't mind being told the truth about a thing that didn't matter. 2 mornings passed before Carl darkened the doorway again. He sat in his usual seat. He cleared his throat. And when I came to take his order, he looked me dead in the eye and said, with the gravity of a man reciting vows, steak and eggs. I wrote it down without blinking, turned the ticket on the wheel, and called back to Grandma, who didn't miss a beat. The grill hissed, the coffee poured, the day continued. There's a special kind of comedy to a person who learns nothing in the exact shape of a lesson, and our diner had ringside seats. What Carl never understood, and what Grandma never stopped teaching me, was that taste isn't a weapon, and food isn't a stage. It's a mercy, a memory, a way to make a morning kinder. If ketchup helps you do that to a lousy steak, God bless the squeeze bottle. If bragging helps you swallow frozen blade at 3 times the price, that's between you and the mirror. Either way, the pie's still warm. After that morning, something in the air around Carl shifted. He still came in like clockwork. Same stool, same overpolished shoes, same routine of tapping his watch and sighing if the coffee took more than 30 seconds. But he wasn't as loud anymore. He didn't announce his order for everyone to hear. He didn't mock the kid from the garage who always got a breakfast sandwich or the single mom who split 1 plate of pancakes with her 2 toddlers. It was like someone had let the air out of him. Not enough to flatten, just enough to stop him from floating above everyone else. The regulars noticed too. One of them, Bill, who came in every morning at 7:15 sharp and read the sports page cover to cover, leaned over to me one day and said, Carl's quiet. You finally muzzle him? I just smiled and kept wiping down the counter. Nah, I said, just served him a side of truth. Bill laughed so hard he almost choked on his toast. But the thing is, Carl didn't stop ordering steak. If anything, he ordered it more. It was as if he needed to prove something. To himself, to us, maybe to the version of him that had been publicly called out and laughed at. Every time he came in, he'd glance at me, daring me to say something, and then mutter, steak and eggs. And every time I wrote it down and handed it off without comment. Grandma, for her part, found the whole thing hilarious. That man's pride is tougher than the meat, she said one morning as she tossed another frozen slab on the grill. If he chews on it long enough, maybe it'll soften up. Probably not. Then she winked and went back to stirring the gravy. Meanwhile, Dave became a bit of a legend. He came back a few times after that first visit, always sat at the same spot, always ordered something other than steak, and always left a tip that made Grandma smile. Sometimes he'd make a little show of picking up the ketchup bottle and giving it a tiny shake in Carl's direction. Carl would pretend not to notice, but his jaw would tighten just a little. It wasn't about ketchup, of course. It never had been. It was about the kind of person who thinks their way is the only way. The kind of person who confuses having standards with looking down on people. Carl wasn't mocking Dave because of steak sauce. He was mocking him because Carl needed to feel superior, and ketchup gave him an excuse. The truth I dropped on him, that the steak was garbage and the price was a joke, took that excuse away. It turned his refined taste into what it really was. Performative nonsense. A couple of weeks after the ketchup incident, Carl came in on a particularly busy Saturday morning. The diner was packed. Farmers just off the early shift. Construction guys grabbing breakfast before heading to a job. Families taking up entire booths. Every table was full, every counter stool taken, and there was a small line forming by the door. And there was Carl sitting on his throne at the end of the counter, waiting for his steak and eggs like always. Halfway through the rush, one of the cooks came out from the back, apron streaked with grease and eyes wide. We're out of steak, he said quietly. I looked at the ticket rail. Sure enough, there was Carl's order, hanging there like a loaded gun. We almost never ran out because, honestly, nobody ordered steak often enough for it to be a problem. But that morning, 2 tourists had come in, both determined to try it just for fun, and now Carl's prize breakfast was a no-go. I walked over to him. Hey, Carl, I said, keeping my voice neutral. We're out of steak today. Want me to get you the pea meal or the breakfast special instead? The look he gave me was pure betrayal. Out of steak? How can you be out of steak? It happens, I said. It's not a big seller, but I can get you something else. Honestly, everything else on the menu is better anyway. He stared at me for a long moment, and then, very slowly, he sighed. Fine, pea meal, whatever. When I brought it to him, he ate it without a word. No commentary, no snide remarks. And when he was done, he left a tip, small but more than usual. That day was the first time I saw Carl as a person and not a caricature. He wasn't humbled exactly, but he wasn't performing either. He was just a man having breakfast. It wasn't the last time he ordered steak. Far from it. He went right back to it the following week. But from that point on, something fundamental had shifted. The mockery never returned. He stopped side-eyeing ketchup bottles. He even started saying hello to Dave when their visits overlapped, though he still avoided conversation. It was like the world had gotten just a little bigger for him, and he didn't quite know how to shrink it back down. And for me, that whole silly saga became one of my favorite stories from my years at the diner. Because it wasn't really about steak or ketchup or even Carl. It was about the weird power dynamics that crop up in the most ordinary places, and how easily they fall apart when someone just once, calls them what they are. I still don't put ketchup on my steak, but I'll defend anyone's right to do it. Because at the end of the day, it's not about the condiment, it's about the fact that food is meant to be enjoyed, not weaponized. And if you can't handle that, maybe the problem isn't the ketchup, maybe it's you. If part of Carl's bluster had deflated after the ketchup incident, the rest of it started leaking out slowly in the weeks that followed. And the more he tried to patch it, the more obvious the holes became. The man couldn't resist trying to reclaim some authority. He'd make comments like, "At least I know how to order a proper breakfast," or "Some of us have refined palates." But every time he did, someone at the counter would smirk. Bill might mutter, "Cheapest cut in town," just loud enough for him to hear. Dave, who'd become a bit of a regular, would order the exact same steak and then drown it in ketchup with exaggerated ceremony. Even the younger guys bussing tables had taken to calling the steak orders insecurity specials when Carl wasn't listening. The thing is, Carl knew they were talking about him, and he hated it, but he couldn't stop himself from walking right into the trap every time. It was like watching a cat keep swatting at a mirror, furious at the other cat that wouldn't back down. One morning, about a month after the infamous ketchup day, Carl came in early, too early. We were still setting up, chairs half off the tables, coffee just starting to brew. He sat down anyway, like a king showing up before the court, and waved me over. "You know," he started, trying to sound casual, "I've been thinking, maybe you all should consider upgrading the steak. A better cut, something fresh. It would elevate the place." I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Carl, we're a diner. We serve burgers, fries, pie, and breakfast. Nobody comes here expecting a prime rib experience." He sniffed. "Still, you could try. If you raise the price a little more, maybe you could afford it." I laughed. I didn't mean to, but I couldn't help it. "Carl, we tripled the price already. That's what you pay for the privilege of bragging about eating frozen cashew leather." His face tightened, but he pressed on. "I'm just saying, real restaurants take pride in their steak. Real restaurants also have proper storage for fresh meat," I shot back. "We don't. And to be honest, if we stop selling steak tomorrow, I don't think anyone would notice. Except you." That shut him up for the moment, but I could see the gears grinding in his head. Carl wasn't used to being reminded that the world didn't revolve around his opinion. He left without finishing his coffee that day, probably the only time I'd ever seen him do that. A week later, he tried a different tactic. Instead of his usual grand order, he asked for pancakes and bacon. Everyone at the counter, me, Bill, even Grandma from the back, stopped and stared. "You sure?" I asked, pen hovering over the pad. "Yes," he said stiffly. "No steak today." It was supposed to be a power move. I could see that. He wanted to show that he was above the mockery, that he could choose not to be the butt of the joke, but the universe wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Bill, without missing a beat, called down the counter, "Hey, Carl, what happened? Too cheap for steak today?" The place erupted in laughter. Carl's ears went crimson, and I swear I heard him grind his teeth. "Just felt like pancakes," he muttered, but nobody believed him. The next time he came in, he was back to steak and eggs. Pride is a stubborn thing, and Carl's was heavier than the grill itself, but the damage was done. Whatever status steak once had in that diner had been reduced to a running joke. New customers were warned with a grin. "Order it if you want, but we don't recommend it unless you're trying to prove something." Regulars started referring to steak and eggs as the Carl Special. Even Grandma got in on it. One day she sent a plate out with a little flag toothpick stuck in the steak that said Premium Ego Cut. Carl didn't find it funny, but the rest of us did. And Dave? Dave kept coming back. He became one of our favorite regulars. Always polite, always chatting with whoever sat next to him. And every once in a while, he'd order the steak just for the hell of it, smile right at Carl, and drown the thing in ketchup. "Gourmet touch," he'd say, deadpan. It drove Carl nuts. He'd glare, shift in his seat, sigh loudly, but he never said a word again. He learned his lesson the hard way. The moment he opened his mouth, someone would remind him what he was really eating. And the truth, the one that stung the most, was that none of us respected him any less because he liked steak. We respected him less because he built his whole self-image on something that flimsy. Some people order steak because they love steak. Some order it because they want to feel important. And some, like Carl, do it because they think it makes them better than everyone else. But once the curtain's pulled back, once everyone knows the Emperor's premium cut is a frozen slab barely fit for chili, there's no prestige left. Carl was just a guy eating crappy steak and pretending it meant something. And once that illusion cracked, it was never coming back. After that day, when I publicly called out Carl for mocking Dave over ketchup, something shifted in the restaurant's atmosphere. People who had always rolled their eyes at Carl's arrogance suddenly felt emboldened. They started talking louder when he was around, cracking jokes that were just subtle enough to go unnoticed by outsiders, but sharp enough to sting if you were their target. And Carl, for the first time since he'd made our greasy spoon his daily stage, seemed uneasy in his usual booth. He still came in every morning, same seat, same order, same inflated ego, but he avoided eye contact with the regulars now. Gone was the booming voice that had once dominated the room. He spoke quieter, shifted nervously in his chair, and when new customers came in, he didn't even try to educate them on how to eat like a real man. It was as if my little speech about cheap frozen steak had clipped his wings, but deep down, I knew Carl too well to think he was done. People like him don't just fade into the background. They wait, simmering, planning a comeback. And I was right. A few days later, just before the breakfast rush hit, Carl strutted in with his chest puffed out again, a sure sign he'd regained his misplaced confidence. But this time, he wasn't alone. He had brought two new faces with him, men about his age, both dressed in business suits. It was obvious he'd brought them here to put on a show, to rebuild his bruised ego in front of fresh eyes who didn't yet know how ridiculous he could be. Best steak in town, I heard him announce as he slid into his booth, his voice just a bit louder than usual. They know how to treat real customers here. None of that cheap diner stuff. I had to bite my tongue not to laugh. If only his guests knew what real customers were actually being served. I took their orders, 3 steak and eggs, of course, and walked back to the kitchen, shaking my head. When the plates came out, I made sure everything looked exactly how it always did. Mediocre steaks, cooked just enough to pass inspection, still the same frozen cuts we'd always served. I placed the plates in front of them with a smile and stepped back, watching from the corner of my eye as the meal began. Carl dug in first, dramatically slicing into his steak with the smugness of a man certain he was about to prove a point. But the moment his knife scraped against the tough meat, his expression faltered just a little. He chewed, slowly, painfully, and his jaw tightened. One of his guests followed suit and shot Carl a puzzled look. "This is the best steak in town, huh?" the man asked, trying to sound polite but failing miserably. Carl forced a laugh, too loud and too fake. "Of course! You've just gotta get used to it. Real steak isn't soft like the cheap stuff they serve at those fancy restaurants." The second man raised an eyebrow. "Pretty chewy for real steak." Carl's face turned a shade redder, and I swear I saw a bead of sweat form on his temple. He muttered something about the grill being off that day and waved me over, trying to salvage his pride. "Hey," he said, leaning back like he owned the place. "These steaks, they're a little tougher than usual today, huh?" I smiled politely. "No, Carl. They're exactly the same as they've always been. Same cut, same grill, same frozen blade steak you've been ordering for years." His guest snickered. One of them actually put down his fork. "Wait, frozen? You serve frozen steak?" I nodded. "We always have. We tell people it's not our specialty. It's just on the menu for those who insist. Most of our regulars know better than to order it." Carl's jaw clenched, and his 2 guests burst out laughing. One of them even turned to him and said, "Well, I guess that explains the ketchup, huh?" The laughter spread to the next booth. People who'd overheard the exchange were chuckling now, too. Carl sat there staring at his plate, cheeks burning as every word he'd ever said about taste and class came back to slap him in the face. It was subtle, but the humiliation was real and raw. And the best part? I hadn't even tried. All I did was tell the truth. The same truth I'd told him from the very start. From that day forward, Carl never once ordered steak again. After that humiliating breakfast, Carl stopped talking about steak entirely. For a man who used to use every meal as a stage to preach about taste and class, his silence was almost unsettling. He still came in every morning. Habits like his die hard. But now he's stuck to coffee and toast, maybe an omelet if he was feeling bold. And he ate it quietly, eyes on his plate, never looking around to see if anyone was watching him. The rest of the regulars, though, they hadn't forgotten. The story of Carl and the frozen steak spread through the diner faster than the smell of bacon on a Sunday morning. Newcomers would ask about it. Old-timers would retell it with more dramatic flair every time. And the ketchup joke, oh, that one never died. It became an inside joke, a code word. Every now and then, someone would ask for ketchup with their meal and then glance toward Carl's usual booth with a smirk. "Guess I'm ruining perfectly good meat again," they'd say loudly, and the whole place would laugh. Carl would grip his mug a little tighter and stare down into the coffee, pretending he didn't hear. But humiliation, as satisfying as it was, wasn't quite the end. People like Carl don't disappear. They stew. And a few weeks later, he tried again. It was a Saturday, the diner's busiest morning of the week, and nearly every seat was full. I was pouring coffee for a table of regulars when Carl walked in with his head held higher than it had been in weeks. This time, he brought his wife, someone none of us had seen before, and you could tell from the way he fussed over her chair and waved for me to come over that he was trying to reassert himself. "Steak and eggs," he said confidently when I came to take their order. "2, medium rare." I couldn't help it. My eyebrows shot up. "Are you sure, Carl?" I asked, loud enough that a few nearby tables turned to listen. "You haven't ordered steak since, well, you know." A hush fell over the room. Carl forced a chuckle. "I know what I'm ordering. It's for my wife. She's never tried it here." His wife gave him a confused look. "I thought you said the steaks here were terrible." You could practically hear the air being sucked out of the room. Carl went pale, then flushed crimson. I was just joking when I said that," he stammered. "They're fine. Best in town, remember?" That was it. The dam broke. Someone from the counter snorted. Another laughed out loud. And before long, the whole diner was shaking with laughter. Even his wife cracked a smile, looking at him like she was finally seeing through the act. I brought the steaks out about 20 minutes later. Same as always. Tough, bland, and unapologetically mediocre. Carl cut into his with exaggerated confidence, forcing a bite down with a smile that looked more like a grimace. His wife took one bite, set down her fork, and whispered something to him that made his ears go red all over again. When they left, the door hadn't even closed before the laughter started again. Not cruel, not vicious, but enough to let Carl know the performance was over. He wasn't the refined steak connoisseur anymore. He was just Carl, the guy who lectured strangers about ketchup and got roasted harder than any steak ever cooked in our kitchen. And the best part? It wasn't me or any single person who brought him down. It was the truth, plain and simple, spoken out loud and echoed by everyone around him. It was the collective eye roll of a whole diner, full of people who were done with his nonsense. From that day forward, Carl stopped coming in with guests. He sat alone, ordered his toast and coffee, and kept his opinions to himself. No more lectures, no more boasting, just quiet chewing and the occasional nervous glance when someone at the counter asked for ketchup. But as satisfying as it was, I couldn't help but feel that his story wasn't quite finished yet. Carl was humiliated, yes, but people like him never disappear quietly, and part of me knew there was still one more chapter left in this saga. The Saturday breakfast crowd was always the loudest, but that morning the diner had a special kind of electricity humming through it. Carl sat at his usual booth by the window, shoulders hunched, trying to look invisible. It didn't work. Whispered jokes passed from table to table. Little snickers snickers erupted from the counter whenever someone asked for ketchup, and every now and then, someone would glance in his direction and quickly look away before bursting into laughter again. For weeks, he had endured this. Quiet humiliation, mocking smiles, snide remarks that were never quite direct enough to confront. And every day, he swallowed it with his burnt coffee and stale pride. But today was different. Today, Carl snapped. It started small. A guy at the counter ordered a burger and asked for extra ketchup. Harmless enough, but then he grinned and said, "Better add some for the steak, too. Can't have it without the ketchup, right, Carl?" The room erupted. A wave of laughter rolled through the diner, and Carl froze mid-sip. His hands trembled slightly as he put the mug down. For a second, it looked like he might just get up and leave, but then something in his face changed. His jaw tightened, his lips pressed into a thin, angry line, and instead of leaving, he stood. "All right, that's enough," he shouted, loud enough that every head turned. The laughter died instantly. Forks hovered in midair. Coffee cups stopped halfway to lips. "I am sick and tired of being everyone's joke in this damn place." The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Carl's voice shook, whether from anger or humiliation. No one could tell. "You all think you're so clever, don't you? Laughing at me because I like steak, because I have standards, because I know what quality is." Someone at the back coughed. Another chuckled. Carl's face flushed deeper. "You," he snapped, pointing at the man who made the ketchup joke. "You probably don't even know the difference between sirloin and strip steak. Half of you don't. And you," he spun toward a group by the window, "I've seen you eat hot dogs from a gas station, and you want to mock me?" It was unraveling fast. His words were coming quicker now, his voice higher, desperate. "At least I can afford steak. At least I'm not scraping pennies together for a plate of eggs like the same steak you complained about for weeks?" Someone interrupted, voice dripping with amusement. The room exploded. The tension snapped like a rubber band. Laughter crashed over Carl like a tidal wave, louder and harsher than before. Someone clapped sarcastically. Another shouted, "Tell us more about your standards, Carl." His face was the color of overripe tomatoes now. He opened his mouth to say something else, but nothing came out. Just a few choked sounds as the laughter grew. It wasn't cruel, not quite, but it was relentless. And worst of all, it was honest. "Maybe try the ketchup," someone called from the back. "It might make the steak taste like something other than your ego." Carl's eyes darted around the room, wide and furious. But everywhere he looked, there were grins, shaking shoulders, tears of laughter. Even the old-timers, the ones who used to nod approvingly at his pompous little speeches, were laughing now. He grabbed his coat and stumbled toward the door, muttering under his breath, but that only made the laughter swell again. At the door, he turned back for a final attempt at dignity. "You people have no class," he spat. "No appreciation for quality." "Enjoy your frozen steak, Carl," someone yelled. "Don't forget the ketchup." The door slammed behind him, but the laughter followed him out onto the street. After that day, Carl stopped coming for a while. Weeks went by without a trace of him, and when he finally did return, months later, he was a different man. No more speeches, no more sneering at other people's food. He sat quietly, ordered coffee and toast, and kept his eyes on the table. The mighty steak snob of our diner had been reduced to a punchline, and everyone knew it. The legend of Ketchup Carl, as he was now called, became part of the diner's folklore. New customers heard the story within minutes of sitting down. Regulars would reenact the scene just to make each other laugh. And every time someone ordered steak, which to be honest and still sucked, they'd ask with a grin, "Hey, can I get a side of ketchup with that?" Because in the end, Carl had taught us all a lesson he never meant to. It wasn't about steak, it wasn't about ketchup, it was about humility, and what happens when you build your identity on looking down at others. And Carl? He learned that lesson the hard way. Right there, in the same booth where he once mocked everyone else, surrounded by the same people whose approval he craved, he became exactly what he feared most, a joke no one would ever forget.